Hi there, it's John Pushkar. I'm coming to you today with another episode with important information out of the fuels and combustion equipment safety world that hopefully can save your life. Today, it's about that simple, innocent little act of pushing that start button to fire up that boiler, that oven, that furnace, whatever it is at your facility. That's a combustion process that makes things happen. I can't tell you how many times I've been called to a facility to observe the aftermath and try to figure out what happened after a piece of equipment exploded upon its trying to be lit. One of the most tragic events led to the writing of my book, Fuels and Combustion Equipment Safety: What You Don't Know Can Kill You, in 2014. This was after the death of a young man named Apollo Arez. Mr. Arez was a steelworker. He was attempting to light a furnace. He was standing there hitting the start button. What he didn't realize was that there was an accumulated flammable mixture within this furnace. It suddenly ignited, and an inspection door that was on a hinge right next to the start button swung open after the explosion, and part of it hit him in the head and killed him instantly. When I arrived at the scene, some of his coworkers came up to me and handed me a black ribbon. It's the black ribbon you see here on the cover of my book. They said to me, "Mr. Pushkar, would you please join us in our sign of solidarity in our mourning for Apollo Arez?" After I stopped crying, I gladly put on that ribbon, and I vowed that day I would do everything in my power to pass on all the knowledge and information I ever accumulate to try to keep this from ever happening again. It's been my experience that some of the most vulnerable times of operating fuel-fired equipment are when you're starting something up or when someone's troubleshooting that equipment, possibly because it wouldn't light off. It's very rare things are just operating fine and then all of a sudden they turn into a tragedy and explode. No, most often it's a light off or some troubleshooting event. Want to know more about how to recognize some of the hazards associated with starting up systems and troubleshooting them? Keep watching. Over the last 40 years, I've developed and led fuels and combustion equipment safety programs for the largest manufacturers in the world. Today, I'm bringing you knowledge, insights, and best practices about fired equipment and natural gas safety. Over the next few minutes, you'll get the kind of practical, real-life explanations that I've become known for. To really understand the hazard that I'm speaking about here when you're trying to light something off, you need to understand some basics. Like what actually happens? What are the events that are sent into motion when you actually touch that start button? You should know that every time you initiate a light-off process, there's fuel released. This happens when we try to light a pilot and when we try to light the main flame. If your purge is not effective, you'll keep accumulating fuel in the firebox along with air till you ultimately get to some type of a flammable mixture. And then during one of those light-off attempts, when an ignition source from like a spark igniter occurs, there will be that huge explosion, that catastrophic incident that will likely send metal flying in all directions. You should also be aware that it's not only light-off attempts, but it's an audible light-off that you should be careful of. That whoomph sound after you light off is not a good thing. When the actual light-off occurs, how many seconds go by after there's an ignition source introduced is also an important factor. Where do you learn about these things? Well, in our Module 2, Fuel Train Basics, out of the Prescient Technical Services online school, I give you some of this information. And I'm going to pass that on to you right now. It could be vital in you understanding just simple things like where to stand. Did you know that most of the incidents I've investigated where things have flown off, it's all the bolted things that fly off. I instruct people to always stand to the side Never stand in front of a burner. It's this and more that I've got to pass on to you in Module 2. Please join me in watching some of Module 2. The life you save here could just be your own. So next, let's take up the matter of managing safe light-offs. I'm going to take you through this and show you what happens from the time you hit the start button to the time we actually get a flame signal. So here's kind of a sequence of how things happen. And it all starts with us engaging the burner management system. So we hit the start button. The burner management system senses that we're trying to start. It initiates looking at a series of what we call permissives, and we'll discuss that in the next slide. If everything's ready in a startup condition, then a fan starts and we start to purge the system. Now this is with some type of forced draft, balanced draft, or induced draft system. Of course, in a natural draft system, there's no fan to start. So once we prove that we've got the proper amount of purge air, a timer goes off on the burner management system. We then get to the point where the firebox is deemed purged. We then open through some special sequencing the main safety shutoff valve, blocking valve system. We would light a pilot first, most likely, then light the main flame. So I'm going to take you through all of this step by step and show you a lot of details about each step. Now, I'm showing you this because I've mentioned that the burner management system does no process control. It's a sentinel of safety. People talk about combustion control systems. Well, you kind of, when they talk about that, you kind of got to get a little frame of reference going. And you got to talk about, are we talking about the safety side of the house? Or are we talking about the management of the flame size and the process temperature control side of the house? So generally the BMS is a safety control system, and then there'll be a process control system or a combustion control system, which will change the size of the flame and the BTU input. Now, once there's a light-off that has occurred and the BMS knows that, it hands control over to a process or a temperature controller. That's what actually then ramps and modulates and controls the firing rate control valve. So let's get back to what happens when we hit the start button. So there's a thing called a limit string. This is a sequence of contacts that are in series. These are devices or conditions which have to be in a certain state before a next sequence of light-off events can occur. So at a minimum, they're typically things like fuel gas high and low, minimum airflow, maybe there's a damper that needs to be open, but it could be proving that low gas valve position is indeed made. Could be that there's no flame signal. Obviously a good idea to not have a flame signal before the light-off sequence. You could have fuel valve proof of closures. You could have water level types of things in boilers that need to be at some minimum position. So again, you hit the start button, the BMS looks at all the permissives, and it then would allow or permit the next step to occur if these conditions are made. So kind of working backwards, if you're troubleshooting and you hit the start button and nothing is happening, you have to look at one of these conditions to see if one of these conditions is not made or is not occurring. So we talk about fuel valve position switches, and I just wanted to review with you the fact that just as you wouldn't go to the parking lot and floor the accelerator of your car and try to light off, you never want to light off a piece of equipment that's at anything other than low fire. So on relatively larger pieces of equipment, standards require that you have the gas valve at some minimum position. So sometimes that's done by a position switch or a limit switch associated with the fuel valve. I'm showing you that on the left-hand side there. There's a little contact on the valve stem, and it makes that switch. Then on the right-hand side, I'm showing you that there's a position switch buried in an actuator. But again, their function is both the same. They're trying to prevent you from having too large of a gas flow when you light off. Now, low fire gets set at commissioning. It's a very important thing that gets set when a burner is first installed and started up. So after the limit string is made and all of those devices are indicating that you're in a ready to start position, then purging of the firebox and flue gas passages starts. So a fan starts, but it's not enough to know that the fan started. The burner management system needs to know that you have the right airflow. So there's generally some type of means to prove airflow and means to prove that the fan has started. There's generally two conditions that need to be met. So sometimes this is done with a pressure switch. Sometimes it's done with a differential pressure switch. What I'm showing you there in the photo is a differential pressure switch because you see two signal lines going to the pressure switch. So we're looking to have 4 to 8 air changes. NFPA 86 says 4 air changes. If it's a boiler, depends on the type of boiler it is. If it's an NFPA 85 type boiler, the purge time is a minimum of 5 minutes. Gets to be kind of a complex thing with boilers, so you really need to read those pages to understand it. But the timing depends on, of course, the fan capacity and the firebox size. Where do you get fan capacity? Well, from fan curves, from measuring amps on fans, but it's generally good to actually measure that airflow in practice in the field to know that you're getting what you expected to be getting. So on the burner management system display, if it's a Honeywell 7800 series like I'm showing you here on the inset, there should be a purge timer and a purge time indicated and a purge time countdown. So the purge tries to remove flammability risks. It tries to think to itself, well, you know, if there was some type of a leak into the firebox while this equipment has been down, possibly the firebox is full of gas, and the thought of getting 4 complete air changes is trying to get the possible LEL down below a level where there would be ignition when the pilot starts. In Europe, there are more air changes required in their standards. So finally, once we've completed a purge and all the conditions have been met, we would send 120 volts to a ignition transformer. It would make 7,000 to 10,000 volts if it's a natural gas igniter typically, just kind of a little spark plug. And we would light a pilot or light a main flame if it's a direct ignited piece of equipment. Kind of in-depth and personal on spark igniter systems. You can see on the left-hand side there in the picture, the ignition transformer, a cable, and then there's a ceramic igniter with a tip, the spark plug, if you will, and it's got a little crush sleeve around it. If you ever remove one of these, by loosening the crush sleeve, make sure you mark it with a marker so you know the proper insertion depth. Reasons that you might not be lighting off could include the fact that that tip is worn and needs to be cleaned or needs to be replaced or needs to be readjusted. You also want to check cables, make sure that they're securely installed and that the ignition transformer is still functioning. Now, you will see on these displays typically PTFI, which is pilot trial for ignition, and you'll get 10 seconds to light a pilot on gas, and you should really be lighting in 2 or 3 seconds, not 10, but there'll be a countdown, and you can observe when you actually start to see that that's lit. It'll show a flame signal. Neither Prescient Technical Services, Inc. or John R. Pushkar, the presenter and author of this work, warrant or represent expressly or by implication the correctness or accuracy of the content of the information presented. The user or viewer of this work accepts any legal liability or responsibility whatsoever for the consequences of its use and misuse. Hopefully you found something here of value that you can pass on to friends or coworkers. If you can, please hit the like button and share this video. And I'd also like to invite you to the Prescient Technical Services online school, where you'll find more than 20 modules that I've created from knowledge I've acquired over the past 40 years, traveling over 3 million miles and being in and out of more than 300 industrial plants in 12 different countries. So once again, thank you very much for being here. It's my mission to pass on important life-saving information. I'll be releasing one of these videos just about every week. And if you could subscribe in the link below, I'll make sure that you get first notice of every time a new video comes out. Once again, thank you and please have a safe day.